This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Karen Savage, Waco, Texas, March 2007. The Scarlet Pimpernel, by Baroness Orczy. Chapter 2. Dover. The Fisherman's Rest. In the kitchen, Sally was extremely busy. Saucepans and frying pans were standing in rows on the gigantic hearth. The huge stockpot stood in a corner, and the jack turned with slow deliberation and presented alternately to the glow every side of a noble sirloin of beef. The two little kitchen maids bustled around, eager to help, hot and panting, with cotton sleeves well tucked up above the dimpled elbows, and giggling over some private jokes of their own, whenever Miss Sally's back was turned for a moment. And old Jemima, stolid in temper and solid in bulk, kept up a long and subdued grumble, while she stirred the stock-pot methodically over the fire. "What ho, Sally!" came in cheerful, if none too melodious accents from the coffee-room close by. "Lord bless my soul!" exclaimed Sally, with a good-humoured laugh. "What be they all wanting now, I wonder?" "Beer, of course," grumbled Jemima. "You don't expect Jimmy Pitkin to have done with one tankard, do you?" "Mr. Harry, he looked uncommon thirsty too," simpered Martha, one of the little kitchen maids, and her beady black eyes twinkled as they met those of her companion, whereupon both started on a round of short and suppressed giggles. Sally looked cross for a moment, and thoughtfully rubbed her hands against her shapely hips. Her palms were itching, evidently, to come in contact with Martha's rosy cheeks. But inherent good humour prevailed, and with a pout and a shrug of the shoulders she turned her attention to the fried potatoes. "What ho, Sally! Hey, Sally!" And a chorus of pewter mugs, tapped with impatient hands against the oak tables of the coffee-room, accompanied the shouts for mine host's buxom daughter. "Sally!" shouted a more persistent voice, "are you going to be all night with that there beer?" "I do think Father might get the beer for them," muttered Sally, as Jemima stolidly and without further comment took a couple of foam-crowned jugs from the shelf and began filling a number of pewter tankards with some of that home-brewed ale for which the Fisherman's Rest had been famous since the days of King Charles. "He knows how busy we are in here." "Your father is too busy discussing politics with Mr. Empsey to worry himself about you in the kitchen," grumbled Jemima under her breath. Sally had gone to the small mirror which hung in a corner of the kitchen, and was hastily smoothing her hair and setting her frilled cap at its most becoming angle over her dark curls. Then she took up the tankards by their handles, 3 in each strong brown hand, and, laughing, grumbling, blushing, carried them through into the coffee-room. There was certainly no sign of that bustle and activity which kept 4 women busy and hot in the glowing kitchen beyond. The coffee-room of the Fisherman's Rest is a show-place now at the beginning of the 20th century. At the end of the 18th, in the year of grace 1792, it had not yet gained the notoriety and importance which 100 additional years and the craze of the age have since bestowed upon it. Yet it was an old place even then, for the oak rafters and beams were already black with age, as were the panelled seats, with their tall backs, and the long polished tables between, on which innumerable pewter tankards had left fantastic patterns of many-sized rings. In the leaded window high up, a row of pots of scarlet geraniums and blue larkspur gave the bright note of colour against the dull background of the oak. That Mr. Jellyband, landlord of the Fisherman's Rest at Dover, was a prosperous man, was of course clear to the most casual observer. The pewter on the fine old dressers, the brass on the gigantic hearth, shone like silver and gold. The red-tiled floor was as brilliant as the scarlet geranium on the window-sill. This meant that his servants were good and plentiful, that the custom was constant, and of that order which necessitated the keeping up of the coffee-room to a high standard of elegance and order. As Sally came in, laughing through her frowns and displaying a row of dazzling white teeth, she was greeted with shouts and chorus of applause. "Why, here's Sally! What ho, Sally! Hurrah for pretty Sally!" "I thought you'd grown deaf in that kitchen of yours," muttered Jimmy Pitkin, as he passed the back of his hand across his very dry lips. All right," laughed Sally, as she deposited the freshly filled tankards upon the tables. "Why, what a hurry, to be sure! And is your grandmother a-dying, and you wanting to see the poor soul afore she'm gone?" "I never seed such a mighty Russian. A chorus of good-humoured laughter greeted this witticism, which gave the company there present food for many jokes for some considerable time. Sally now seemed in less of a hurry to get back to her pots and pans. A young man with fair curly hair and eager bright blue eyes was engaging most of her attention and the whole of her time, whilst broad witticisms anent Jimmy Pitkin's fictitious grandmother flew from mouth to mouth, mixed with heavy puffs of pungent tobacco smoke. Facing the hearth, his legs wide apart, a long clay pipe in his mouth, stood mine host himself, worthy Mr. Jellyband, landlord of the Fisherman's Rest, as his father had before him, ay, and his grandfather and great-grandfather too, for that matter. Portly in build, jovial in countenance, and somewhat bald of pate, Mr. Jellyband was indeed a typical rural John Bull of those days, the days when our prejudiced insularity was at its height, when to an Englishman, be he lord, yeoman, or peasant, the whole of the continent of Europe was a den of immorality, and the rest of the world an unexploited land of savages and cannibals. There he stood, mine worthy host, firm and well set up on his limbs, smoking his long churchwarden, and caring nothing for nobody at home, and despising everybody abroad. He wore the typical scarlet waistcoat, with shiny brass buttons, the corduroy breeches, and the grey worsted stockings and smart buckled shoes that characterized every self-respecting innkeeper in Great Britain in these days, and while pretty motherless Sally had need of 4 pairs of brown hands to do all the work that fell on her shapely shoulders, worthy Jellyband discussed the affairs of nations with his most privileged guests. The coffee-room, indeed, lighted by 2 well-polished lamps which hung from the raftered ceiling, looked cheerful and cosy in the extreme. Through dense clouds of tobacco smoke that hung about in every corner, the faces of Mr. Jellyband's customers appeared red and pleasant to look at, and on good terms with themselves, their host, and all the world. From every side of the room loud guffaws accompanied pleasant, if not highly intellectual, conversation, while Sally's repeated giggles testified to the good use Mr. Harry Waite was making of the short time she seemed inclined to spare him. They were mostly fisher-folk who patronized Mr. Jellyband's coffee-room, but fishermen are known to be very thirsty people. The salt which they breathe in when they are on the sea accounts for their parched throats when on shore. But the Fisherman's Rest was something more than a rendezvous for these humble folk. The London and Dover coach started from the hostel daily, and passengers who had come across the Channel, and those who started for the grand tour, all became acquainted with Mr. Jellyband, his French wines, and his home-brewed ales. It was towards the close of September 1792, and the weather, which had been brilliant and hot throughout the month, had suddenly broken up. For 2 days torrents of rain had deluged the south of England, doing its level best to ruin what chances the apples and pears and late plums had of becoming really fine, self-respecting fruit. Even now it was beating against the leaded windows and tumbling down the chimney, making the cheerful wood fire sizzle in the hearth. "Lud, did you ever see such a wet September, Mr. Jellyband?" asked Mr. Hempseed. He sat in one of the seats inside the hearth, did Mr. Hempseed, for he was an authority and important personage, not only at the Fisherman's Rest, where Mr. Jellyband always made a special selection of him as a foil for political arguments, but throughout the neighbourhood, where his learning, and notably his knowledge of the Scriptures, was held in the most profound awe and respect. With one hand buried in the capacious pockets of his corduroys, underneath his elaborately worked, well-worn smock, the other holding his long clay pipe, Mr. Hempseed sat there, looking dejectedly across the room at the rivulets of moisture which trickled down the window-panes. "No," replied Mr. Jellyband sententiously, "I dunno, Mr. Hempseed, as I ever did. And I've been in these parts nigh on 60 years. Aye, you wouldn't recollect the first 3 years of them 60, Mr. Jellyband," quietly interposed Mr. Hempseed. "I dunno as I ever seed an infant take much note of the weather, leastways not in these parts, and I've lived here nigh on 75 years, Mr. Jellyband." The superiority of this wisdom was